Chapter 13. Outings, Explorations. Once we settled into Block 28, that ache I'd felt since soon after we arrived at Manzanar subsided. It didn't entirely disappear, but it gradually submerged, as semblances of order returned and our pattern of life assumed its new design. For one thing, Keo and I and all the other children finally had a school. During the first year, teachers had been volunteers, equipment had been makeshift. Classes were scattered all over camp, in mess halls, recreation rooms, wherever we could be squeezed in. Now a teaching staff had been hired. 2 blocks were turned into Manzanar High, and a third block of 15 barracks was set up to house the elementary grades. We had blackboards, new desks, reference books, lab supplies. That second, stable school year was one of the things our world commemorated when it came out in June of 1944. My days spent in classrooms are largely a blur now as one merges into another. What I see clearly is the face of my 4th grade teacher, a pleasant face, but completely invulnerable, it seemed to me at the time, with sharp, commanding eyes. She came from Kentucky. She wore wedgies, loose slacks, and sweaters that were too short in the sleeves. A tall, heavy-set spinster, about 40 years old, she always wore a scarf on her head, tied beneath the chin, even during class, and she spoke with a slow, careful Appalachian accent. She was probably the best teacher I've ever had, strict, fair-minded, dedicated to her job. Because of her, when we finally returned to the outside world, I was, academically at least, more than prepared to keep up with my peers. I see her face. But what I hear, still ringing in my mind's ear, is the glee club I belonged to, made up of girls from the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. We rehearsed every day during the last period. In concert, we wore white cotton blouses and dark skirts. 40 voices strong, we would line up at assemblies or at talent shows in the fire break and sing out in unison all the favorites school kids used to learn. Beautiful Dreamer, Down by the Old Mill Stream, Shine on Harvest Moon, Battle Hymn of the Republic. Outside of school, we had a recreation program with leaders hired by the War Relocation Authority. During the week, they organized games and craft activities. On weekends, we often took hikes beyond the fence. A series of picnic groups and camping sites had been built by internees, clearings with tables, benches, and toilets. The first was about half a mile out, the farthest several miles into the Sierras. As restrictions gradually loosened, you could measure your liberty by how far they'd let you go. To Camp 3 with a Caucasian, to Camp 3 alone, to Camp 4 with the Caucasian, to Camp 4 alone. As 4th and 5th graders, we usually hiked out to Camp 1, on the edge of Bears Creek, where we could wade, collect rocks, and sit on the bank eating lunches the mess hall crew packed for us. I would always take along a quart jar and a white handkerchief and sit for an hour next to the stream, watching it strain through the cloth, trickling under the glass. Water there was the clearest I've ever seen, running right down off the snow. One of our leaders on these excursions was a pretty young woman named Lois, about 25 at the time, who wore long braids, full skirts, and peasant blouses. She was a Quaker, like so many of the Caucasians who came in to teach and do volunteer work. She also had a crush on a tall, very handsome and popular Nisei boy who sometimes sang and danced in the talent shows. His name was Esau. In order to find a little free time together, Lois and Esau arranged an overnight camping trip for all the girls in our class. We took jars for water, potatoes to roast, and army blankets, and hiked up Bears Creek one Friday afternoon to a nice little knoll at the base of the mountains. All the girls were tittering and giggling at the way Esau and Lois held hands and looked at each other. They built us a big driftwood fire that night and told us ghost stories until they figured we had all dozed off. Then they disappeared for a while into the sagebrush. I was still awake, and heard their careful footsteps snapping twigs. I thought how hard it would be to walk around out there without a flashlight. It was years later that I remembered and understood what that outing must have been for them. At the time, I had my own escape to keep me occupied. In truth, I barely noticed their departure. This was the first overnight camping trip I'd ever made. For me, it was enough to be outside the barracks for a night, outside the square mile of wire, next to a crackling blaze and looking at stars so thick and so close to the ground, I could have reached up and scooped out an armful. If I had been told the next morning that I could stay outside the fence as long as I wanted, that I was free to go, it would have sent me sprinting for the compound. Lovely as they were to look at, the Sierras were frightening to think about, an icy barricade. If you took off in the opposite direction and made it past the Iños, you'd hit Death Valley, while to the south there loomed a range of brown, sculpted hills everyone said were full of rattlesnakes. Camp 1 was about as far as I cared to venture. What's more, Block 28 was where I lived now. One night was plenty, one night every once in a while, to explore whatever was out there. You might call that the image for a whole series of little explorations I began to make during the next year, looking for some place outside, early gropings for that special thing I could be or do for myself. In addition to the regular school sessions and the recreation program, classes of every kind were being offered all over camp. Singing, acting, trumpet playing, tap dancing, plus traditional Japanese arts like needlework, judo, and kendo. The first class I attended was in baton twirling, taught by a chubby girl about 14 named Nancy. In the beginning, I used a sawed-off broomstick with an old tennis ball stuck on one end. When it looked like I was going to keep at this, Mama ordered me one like Nancy's from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Nancy was a very good twirler and taught us younger kids all her tricks. For months, I practiced, joined the baton club at school, and even entered contests. Since then, I've often wondered what drew me to it at that age. I wonder, because of all the activities I tried out in camp, this was the one I stayed with. In fact, returned to almost obsessively when I entered high school in Southern California a few years later. By that time, I was desperate to be accepted, and baton twirling was one trick I could perform that was thoroughly, unmistakably American. Putting on the boots and a dress crisscrossed with braid, spinning the silver stick and tossing it high to the tune of a John Philip Sousa march. Even at 10, before I really knew what waited outside, the Japanese in me could not compete with that. It tried, in camp and many times later in one form or another. My visit to the old geisha who lived across the fire break was a typical example of how these attempts turned out. She was offering lessons in the traditional dancing called odori. A lot of young girls studied this in order to take part in the big Obon festival held every August, a festival honoring dead ancestors, asking them to bring good crops in the fall. She was about 70, a tiny, aristocratic-looking woman. She took students in her barracks cubicle, which was fitted out like a little Buddhist shrine with tatami mats on the floor. She would kneel in her kimono and speak very softly in Japanese, while her young assistant would gracefully swing closed knees or bend her swan-like neck to the old geisha's instructions. I sat across the room from her for an hour trying to follow what was going on. It was all a mystery. I had never learned the language. And this woman was so old, even her dialect was foreign to me. She seemed an occult figure, more spirit than human. When she bowed to me from her knees at the end of the hour, I rushed out of there, back to more familiar surroundings. Something about her fascinated me, though. For a while, I tried to keep in contact with her lore via the reports of two girls from my class, Reiko and Mitsue, who had stayed on as students. Because they came from wealthy families and spoke and understood both English and Japanese, they had high opinions of themselves. Whenever I pressed them for details of what they'd learned, they would tease me. "A good dancer must have good skin," Reiko would say. "In order to have good skin, you must rub Rose Brilliantine hair tonic on your face and rub cold cream in your hair." I went home and did this secretly when no one else was around and waited for my skin to become the skin of an odori dancer. "You have to think about your clothing," Mitsue would tell me. "A good dancer is recognized by her clothing. You should wear your stockings inside out and never, never wear any underpants." I did this too, on the sly, until Mama asked me why my socks were always inside out and why I was wearing nothing underneath my dress. She was not amused when I explained it to her. She told me to stay away from those girls. They were just being mean, and if I wanted lessons from the old geisha woman, Mama herself would take me over there and arrange it. I shook my head and told her no, I didn't want to do that right now. I had another kind of dancing in mind. This time, it was ballet. I had never seen ballet, I'd only heard of it. But it sounded like something I would want to do. In Ocean Park, I had taken tap dancing lessons. My older brothers would coax me to perform for visitors, and it gained me a lot of attention. In camp, I had already danced in a couple of talent shows. When the word came around that a woman was offering ballet lessons, I showed up with 3 other young girls. It was a dusty day anyhow, and there wasn't much you could do outside. The classroom was an abandoned barracks. No one had lived there for months. Light showed through the warped planking. It was almost like going back 2 years to the day we first arrived, except that a piano sat on the bare, splintered boards, and here was a 30-ish Japanese woman with her hair pulled back in a chignon, wearing a pink tutu, a pair of pink toe dancing shoes, and no tights. At the piano sat a young girl with glasses on, studying some sheet music in the not quite adequate light from a single overhead bulb. When we were all in the room and seated on the floor, she began to play, and the dancer began to dance as if she were the one trying out, not us. She twirled and she leaped from wall to wall, flinging her arms. She had been a good dancer once, but now she was overweight and sad to watch, even in the eyes of a 10-year-old who had never seen this kind of dancing. I was intrigued by her strange, flat-toed shoes, badly frayed, worn down by the boards. I stared, too, at her legs. I could not stop watching them while she spun, sidestepping knotholes. They were thick, white, blue-veined, tapering sharply from the quivering thighs, the kind of legs my older sisters would have called daikonashi. Daikon means horseradish, ashi is leg. She began to show us a few steps and tricks, beginning with the splits. She hoisted herself and reversed her torso and came down again with her legs spread. I winced, sure the planks would tear her skin. Then she got the 4 of us up to try first position, which I did mainly out of courtesy, in order not to hurt the feelings of this heavy woman with her daikonashi and her shredded shoes. After showing us the first 3 ballet positions, she sat down to rest. She took her shoes off. Her toes were showing blood. I noticed then the lines in her face, the traces of gray in her black hair. I felt so sorry for her, I decided to go ahead and sign up for her course. But once I left that room, back out into the dusty, wind-flurried afternoon, I never did return. Ballet seemed then some terrible misuse of the body, and she was so anxious to please us. Her very need to hold on to whatever she had been scared me away. Among my explorations during these months, there was one more final venture into Catholicism. The Manzanar Chapel was just up the street now and easy to get to. I resumed my catechism. Once again, I was listening with rapt terror to the lives of the saints and the martyrs, although that wasn't really what attracted me this time. I had found another kind of inspiration, had seen another way the church might make me into something quite extraordinary. I had watched a girl my own age shining at the center of one of their elaborate ceremonies. It appealed to me tremendously. She happened to be an orphan, and I figured that if this much could befall an orphan, imagine how impressive I would look in such a role. I had long observed her from a distance, a slim and lovely girl, and always aloof because of the way other kids treated orphans there, as if a lack of parents put you somehow beneath everyone else. I confess I felt that way myself. Orphans were in a class apart. In Block 28, we saw them often. Children's Village, where Sister Suzanne and Sister Bernadette put in a good deal of time, was as near to us as their chapel, 2 blocks away in the opposite direction. Each day, about a dozen of them, including this girl, would come trooping past our barracks on the way to a catechism lesson. On days I intended to go, I would wait till they were half a block ahead, so I wouldn't be seen arriving in their midst. This girl had already been baptized. What I witnessed was her confirmation. She was dressed like a bride, in a white gown, white lace hood, and sheer veil, walking toward the altar down the aisle of that converted barracks. Watching her from the pew, I was pierced with an envy for the position she had gained. At the same time, I was filled with awe and with a startled wonder at the notion that this girl, this orphan, could become such a queen. A few days later, I let it be known that I was going to be baptized into the church and confirmed as soon as the nuns thought I was ready. I announced this to the sisters, and they rejoiced. I announced it at home, and Papa exploded. "No!" he roared. "Absolutely not!" I just stood there, stunned, too scared to speak. "You're too young!" I started to cry. "How are you going to get married?" he shouted. "If you get baptized a Catholic, you have to marry a Catholic. No Japanese boys are in the Catholic Church. You get baptized now, how are you going to find a good Japanese boy to marry?" I ran to Mama, but she knew better than to argue with him about this. I ran to the chapel and told Sister Bernadette, and she came hurrying to the barracks. She and Papa had become pretty good friends over the months. Once every week or so she would visit, and while he sipped his apricot brandy, they would talk about religion. But this time, when she came to the door and called, "Wakatsuki-san?" he met her there shouting, "No, no baptism!" She raised her eyebrows, trying to stare him down. He rose to his full height, as if she, about the size of Mama, were the general of some invading army, and said, "Too young." "Old enough to know God? Who knows anything of God at 10? This made her angry. At any other time they would have taken an hour hearing each other out, but now, when she opened her mouth to reply, his upheld flat palm stopped her. He was not going to argue. He wouldn't even let her pass the door. In exasperation, she glared at him, then turned and walked away. I ran to my bunk, devastated, and wept, hating him. I was too ashamed to go back to catechism after that. I just hated Papa for weeks, and dreamed of the white-gowned princess I might have become. Late afternoons, practicing my baton in the fire break, angrily I would throw him into the air and watch him twirl and catch him, and throw him high again and again and again.